Today we're going to continue our series in the book of Revelation, and this is going to be the introduction, part 3. By way of review, we've talked up until this point about the importance of understanding Johannine literature and seeing Revelation as a part of a body of work that was produced in what we know as the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Revelation. And I discussed the importance in the keys to a proper interpretation is within Johannine literature to recognize dominant themes, motifs, patterns, symbols, and recurring words or concepts. And especially in Revelation, you could even broaden that to recognizing these things in the whole of the Old Testament, which John alludes to time and time again throughout the Revelation. We also talked about the 4 main interpretive methods, the approaches to understanding the book of Revelation, and I think I presented you not an exhaustive view or the variants within each of these groups, but a general overview of each of these approaches that have been taken in interpretive methods that have really dominated in church history or in recent times in which we've been exposed to. Today I'm going to transition into what is a more normal introduction for us, something that we do before every book study. And we're going to ask some questions that we need to answer the best that we can with the information we have available through the ancient writings. And that will prepare us to understand the book of Revelation and to interpret it properly. Because our first primary goal in any book study is to understand what is written therein. And there are certain questions that must be asked and answered if we are going to do that responsibly. And I think we should all have that desire within us to do that. So the first question that I want to ask is, who wrote Revelation? And you don't have to look very far into the text. In verse 4, it says, "The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly take place. And he sent and signified it by his angel to his servant John." So here the author is named as John, but there's a debate over which John wrote the Revelation. And I've explained to you there is a common belief amongst modern scholarship that the Apostle John couldn't have written Revelation because it is different than the Gospel of John, it's different than the Epistles of John, or at least it's claimed, because vocabulary is different and things of that nature. I've already answered that rebuttal, and it's to be explained by the obvious difference in genre. We're going to talk more about genre here in just a moment, and the use of amanuensis in that day, someone that John or Paul or any of the apostles would have spoken to, and they as scribes would have written down what they were saying to them, and they had some liberty to use words that they knew and understood in their Greek vocabulary, and sometimes they're more particular in different ways. But I want to appeal to early church history, because we have early church historians called the first century church fathers, or second century church fathers, who wrote in regard to who the author of Revelation is. And I think that carries weight, because you have people who are a few decades removed or who lived during the time of John, who are saying John, the apostle of Jesus Christ, wrote the Revelation. That carries a lot of weight because they are eyewitnesses of the person who wrote this account that we have in the Revelation. So, first of all, let me point out that we have a large body of writing by a man by the name of Irenaeus. Irenaeus lived from 130 to 202 AD, so he's a generation or so removed from the apostles. But he was in contact with those who personally knew John. And he wrote a lot as a bishop. He ended up being a bishop in Lyons, France. But he was from Smyrna. That should jump out in our minds because we know that Smyrna is one of the churches that John wrote to in this book called the Revelation, this letter. So Irenaeus, who was from Smyrna, had and heard and interacted with a bishop by the name of Polycarp, who was the bishop or the pastor at Smyrna, of all places. And Polycarp lived from 65 to 155 AD. He was a contemporary. His life overlapped with the Apostle John. John, working with that network of churches there in Asia Minor, would have had correspondence and dealings with the Apostle John. And Polycarp states that John is the author of the Revelation. Polycarp was also a companion of Papias, who was a personal disciple of John, who lived from 60 to 130 AD. And he was a bishop of Hierapolis, and I'll show you on the map where that is and why that's significant. Because you have two figures, Polycarp and Papias, contemporaries of John. Irenaeus knows Polycarp, was there in Smyrna where he was a bishop. And then you have Papias, who was a personal disciple of John, and he was the bishop in Hierapolis. Do you see where it is located? Next to Laodicea and the other churches, which are part of the network of churches that were written to in the Revelation. So you have a close proximity, overlapping lives of those who knew John, and you have a man who knew those two individuals who personally knew John, writing and stating that John, the disciple and the apostle of Jesus Christ, was the author of the book of Revelation. Good enough for me. Good enough for me. The vocabulary differences because of the genre is not weightier to me than people from that day and age saying that John wrote the Revelation. John, the apostle and disciple of Jesus Christ. Other appeals and arguments are made against John being the author, such as he never states his apostleship. Well, the only time you have to state your apostleship is when your apostleship is in question. John was never in question as being an apostle. He was universally recognized as one of the inner circle of Jesus during his earthly ministry. And unlike the Apostle Paul, his apostleship was never in question. The reason why in Paul's letters he is constantly referring to himself as an apostle is because in part he is defending himself and qualifying himself as an apostle because he was an anomaly as an apostle because he was not a direct eyewitness of Jesus' earthly ministry step for step. So Paul had to defend his apostleship, and he even had to subject himself to the 12 that were chosen by Jesus. He had to come under their authority even. But John never had to defend his apostleship. And the fact that he refers to himself as a servant is a humble, pious way that was very normal for the apostles of Jesus to refer to themselves. They viewed themselves as slaves or servants of Jesus Christ. And so the fact that he doesn't appeal to his apostleship really carries no weight or significance in who wrote the Revelation. So there are other claims and arguments that are made against his apostleship, but they don't carry enough weight to even really be entertained. In some of the resources that are recommended, they develop all of these arguments for and against. You can read through those for yourself, but I find none that carry the weight of these second century claims by those who knew John, stating that he wrote the Revelation. And historically, we know that the Apostle John dealt with these churches here in Asia Minor extensively until the time of his death. Matter of fact, his grave is believed to be in Ephesus. And so that carries a lot of weight. And so I'm going to rest my case on the authorship of the Revelation with that evidence that we have from the 1st and 2nd century. The next question that we're going to ask is, to whom was Revelation written? And as always, who was it not written to? Us. Revelation was not written to us. We need to understand that if we're going to be responsible and interpret it properly. Revelation was not written to us. Now, while we should be looking for analogy and application from that analogy, it must begin with a proper interpretation that can only come through an understanding of who it was written to and understanding their cultural environment. So it says in verse 4 of Revelation, specifically John, to the 7 churches which are in Asia. Are we in Asia? So who was it written to? The 7 churches which are in Asia. Asia, or we say Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, on the western coast. That is who it was written to. We're going to get to it in the coming weeks, but those 7 churches are listed here, beginning with Ephesus and ending in Laodicea. And these churches were situated in a culture that is very, very different than ours. Okay? Their historical situation, their cultural setting, their lives were different in many regards than ours. Now, there are analogies that we can extract from their experience and the things that they are being written to and addressed concerning. But we need to understand that these cities were in Asia Minor under Roman imperial rule. Therefore, we need to understand the Roman Empire. We need to understand what those under this imperial rule dealt with on a day-in, day-out basis. We need to understand that in the case of the first 3 cities that are named there, all of them, because of imperial rule, had erected temples that were devoted to the emperor and emperor worship. The emperor of Rome in these cities was worshipped. He was deified. And if you were going to participate in society normally, you had to recognize emperor worship. You had to engage in their productions, their festivities that were prevalent in all of these cities, because they had frequent banquets to these patron deities and to the emperor worship, and refusal to participate in these meant ostracization, persecution, and as we'll see in Revelation, that was ramping up during the time that was written, and it was going to climax into imprisonment and even death. And so we need to understand what they were facing as Christians who would refuse to engage, who would refuse to go to these temples that were dedicated to the various gods, or the temples that were dedicated to the worship of the emperor. We need to understand that as being part of the dynamic in which John will address and polemicize throughout the symbolism portrayed in the Revelation. These three cities that we see listed first that had these temples dedicated to the emperor were labeled temple warden cities, and there were advantages that were given, privileges economically and socially for any city that embraced this and those who participated in it, from the trade guilds, from the artisans, from the craftsmen. If you did not participate, you were marginalized. They would starve you out, and they would essentially force you to engage in their festivities devoted to pagan deities and the emperor, or you suffered economic hardship, social excommunication, and the likes. And so many Christians were compromising from within these churches. And that's part of what John will address in Revelation by command of the Lord. And so we need to understand these dynamics. One of the most helpful resources for understanding the cultural background to these seven churches, I mentioned in our Facebook group, and that is an introduction to the New Testament, context, methods, and ministry formation, the second edition by David De Silva. It is very, very well. He is an expert in Second Temple literature and the background of the New Testament. And I highly, highly recommend you getting that resource and reading through his introduction to the book of Revelation and setting it in its historical context and setting. It is a brilliant, brilliant work. And I don't say that about very many works. So take that for what it's worth. It is very helpful. So these cities, again, were found within that square in western, what is modern-day Turkey, in Asia Minor. These seven cities were specifically written to, and we're going to see what was written when we get to chapters 2 and 3. John writes to them about specific issues, and he encourages them in specific ways related to the things that they were dealing with. And so we need to understand these are intended for these seven churches, and we have to interpret it as if we were one of them. Okay? A lot of times Revelation is portrayed as a mystical book that can only be unlocked in the end of days. That is like the antithesis of truth. It was written to seven real churches right here, and if anyone would have understood the symbolism and the imagery, the illusions, the polemical undertones of what is said in Revelation, it would have been these churches right here, because it was their world, and they would have understood what John was trying to say and where he was trying to lead them. The next question that we're going to ask is, when was Revelation written? This is kind of important, especially to the preterist. Remember, the preterist treats the book of Revelation as containing prophecy that has been, in large part or entirely, fulfilled by 70 A.D., and so that necessitates the need for Revelation to be written before 70 A.D. And honestly, there is no historical evidence that supports this view. You can read through the recommended resources that I assigned and see some of the cases for a pre-70 date, but they really don't carry much weight when you examine them critically. But we do have Irenaeus that I mentioned earlier, who lived in the 2nd century A.D., who writes in his Against Heresies, Book 5 in chapter 3, he says this. I'm going to read the whole part of the quote, but the part that I have highlighted is what's important for us in the dating of Revelation. He says, "We will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing positively as to the name of the Antichrist. For if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in this present time, it would have been announced by him who had beheld the apocalyptic vision. For that was seen not very long time since, but almost in our day," and then he dates it, "towards the end of Domitian's reign." And so here we have someone, again, who is connected to Polycarp and Papias, who are connected directly to John. He's from Smyrna, one of the cities that are addressed in the Revelation. And he dates when this revelation was given, and he specifically says towards the end of Domitian's reign, which is why for most of church history, it is known that the Emperor Domitian reigned from 81 to 96 AD, and so it's been universally taught until recent years that it was written in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, towards the end of the reign of the Emperor Domitian, just like Irenaeus said. And there's no good reason to doubt what Irenaeus is claiming because of his connection to Papias and Polycarp. Now, I want to show you a writing that is dated to about 110 AD. But I want you to focus. You see that arrow there? The first one is in the proximity of the seven churches. And we would include Hierapolis because it's right there in that network of churches that would have received the circular letter that Revelation was. But notice this arrow here is in an area called Bithynia. And you can see it's right here as well in this map. Well, Pliny the Younger writes to the Emperor Trajan, who reigned after Domitian. There was a 2-year reign of Nerva, I believe, before Trajan. But Pliny the Younger writes to Trajan concerning this region right here and dealing with Christians in that region. I'm going to quote him. This is dated to around 110. This is what he says. "I ask them if they are Christians. If they admit it, I repeat the question a second and a third time, threatening capital punishment." Anyone know what capital punishment was? Death. "If they persist, I sentence them to death. For I do not doubt that, whatever kind of crime it may be to which they have confessed, their pertinency and inflexible obstinacy should certainly be punished. All who denied that they were or had been Christians, I consider discharged, because they called upon the gods at my dictation and did reverence with incense and wine to your image, which, are y'all listening? To your image, which I had ordered to be brought forward for this very purpose, together with the statues of the deities, and especially because they cursed Christ, a thing which it is said, genuine Christians cannot be induced to do. Why is this important to the dating of the Revelation? Because Revelation just describes in symbolism what we just read, where they are coerced to denounce Christ, to worship the beast, and to submit to the societal demands within the empire that they lived. And they could have gotten out of persecution and death by simply denouncing Christ. This is what was escalating during the time that John writes the Revelation. So if he wrote the Revelation in the mid-90s, it makes sense that here in 110, it has escalated to the point that Christians are actively being put to death in the same region that these churches are written to, in a region where the circular letter of Revelation would have no doubt reached and been read. And here we have what was said to be being realized and actualized in that same region. And we have a historical writing from a pagan source affirming the predictions within the Revelation. I think that's very fascinating, and it does indeed help us affirm the date of the Revelation as given by Irenaeus to the mid-90s, mid to late 90s AD. That is a fatal blow to a solely preterist view of Revelation, by the way. What source materials are used in Revelation? There's one major source that is used in Revelation as far as the symbolism and the imagery, and that is an allusion to the Old Testament. Revelation is a standalone category of itself in its allusions to the Old Testament. Now, here's what we need to recognize about John's use of symbols that are allusions to the Old Testament. He knows the original context of the Old Testament allusions that he uses in Revelation. But he takes and he repurposes and he reinterprets and reapplies them for his own purposes in relation to the churches that he is writing to. But at the same time, and this is brilliant, he preserves a linked analogical value to the context and the stories that he draws his allusions from. Brilliant. Just to give you an example, in Revelation, he draws from the plagues of Exodus. In the plagues of Exodus, they are all a climax to the salvation of God's people and the judgment of those who withstood God, His plan, and His people. And that's what Revelation is capturing in large part, is that struggle, but it's reminding them of that story, and in that story, who won? The gods of Egypt were all defeated in the plagues. The plagues, you guys remember the Exodus? The plagues were all polemically charged against the gods of Egypt. And so he takes those symbols, he takes those from those stories, and he's reminding them, God prevailed then, God will prevail again. God's people were saved and vindicated then. They will be saved and vindicated again. He does this over and over in the allusions that he draws from, and it's very, very brilliant. Just to show you something that if you have Logos, you can see this for yourself. It's called the New Testament use of the Old Testament. I don't know if you can see that, but I'll upload the PowerPoint for you guys. This is a snapshot of one of the screens that I've been working with during this study. And you'll notice right here that it's showing the occurrences of allusions, echoes, or quotations in each book of the New Testament. And it prioritizes them by the New Testament book that has the most allusions, echoes, or citations or quotations from the Old Testament. Do you see what's at the top of the list? For some of you that may not see that very well, let me zone in. Do you see what's at the top? Revelation. Now, it's debated how many actual allusions. Some estimate that they're up upwards up to 700 allusions in Revelation. But do you notice how much more it is than what is second most in Acts 590 to 284? You guys remember in the introduction part 1 when I showed you recurring words and how the revelation was linked to not only Johannine literature but also the Gospels and Acts? Here you're seeing that, and it's because there's such a high volume usage of the Old Testament in each of these writings in a fulfillment type of way or an analogical type of way. So Revelation makes use of the Old Testament time and time again, in particular, and really in this order: Isaiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, Psalms, Genesis, Deuteronomy, Jeremiah, Joel, and Zechariah. Borrows from the imagery and the context that are in those books the most and reapplies them to the situation in the 7 churches in Asia Minor. And so, would it be safe to say that the better we understand the Old Testament, the more helpful it will be knowing these contexts that are alluded to? What I'm going to try to do more so in this study of Revelation compared to the one we did, 9 years ago, is I'm going to try to take more time and go back to those Old Testament contexts and draw the analogy. Show you the analogy that John makes between the Old Testament context, the historical situation in the first century, and then I want to take it one step further and I want to draw an analogy to our day. What is the principle in each of these stories? What is the application? What does God want in their response? And what would God want in our response? Okay, so we're going to try to modernize it or bring an analogy or a parallel to our day, because something that I've learned in ministry is people aren't drawing these analogies and these parallels by themselves. And so I've taken it upon myself to try to help in that regard, even though it should be simpler than what I've seen or recognized. So we're going to spend some time doing that. The next question that we need to ask is, what is the genre of Revelation? A lot of people would say, what does genre matter? It matters a whole heck of a lot in anything. When you're dealing with literary writing, genre matters a lot. And genre matters especially in the case of Revelation, because we talked about how that it's a body of work within Johannine literature. We noted the differences because the Gospel of John is a biography and a historiography, and so some of its content is different in wording and vocabulary than in the epistles, which are church letters addressing specific problems in this network of churches in and around Ephesus, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Revelation. Now, Revelation is unique. It is a one-of-a-kind as far as genre in the New Testament, because it is a letter, a prophecy, and it is also apocalyptic in genre. It falls in all 3 of these categories, and that's very unique. And so I want to talk first about the fact that it is a letter, which is why you see letter highlighted here. And that is obvious in that within it, when we get into the substance of it, you'll see that it's a letter written to 7 churches, and it is written to be circular, oracular, to be read aloud in one setting. It has a personal address and a personal farewell, a prologue or a benediction. Let me show you the prologue. John, to the 7 churches which are in Asia, grace to you and peace from Him who is and who was and who is to come, from the 7 spirits who are before His throne, and from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn of the dead, and the ruler of kings on earth. That's the prologue. And that's very similar to what you see in the letters that any of the New Testament authors wrote. You have a greeting, and then almost all the letters in the New Testament have a benediction or a farewell, which is what we see in Revelation 22, verse 21, when he says, "The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. Amen." So it was a letter. Chapters 2 and 3, we're going to see specifically, it is a letter that is addressing specific problems in each of these churches. It encourages, it warns, and it brings guidance to each of these 7 churches in very particular ways. And so we need to understand that it is a letter. But not only is it a letter, but it's also prophecy. Now, when we hear prophecy, we automatically think of the foretelling of the end of days or foretelling of future events in a matter-of-fact, very literal fashion. But actually, prophecy, if you study it out, it can include foretelling. Usually the foretelling is more relative to the immediate future, not the distant future. But it's more forthtelling than it is foretelling. When you read the prophets, the major and the minor prophets, you will find that the major message in all of them is repent. Return to God. Prioritize the one true and living God. Stop compromising. Stop blending in. Stop conforming to this world and return to the Word of God and following the ways of God. And so prophecy is primarily designed to bring desired changes and to offer encouragement to the faithful. When you read all of the prophets, they are continually calling for reform and for repentance. Now let's see in the letter itself where it's actually said that Revelation is a prophecy, shall we? Verse 3 says, "Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy. And blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in it, for the time is in the remote future at the end of days." Come on, I'm going to get on the preterist bandwagon because it is applicable to the 7 churches it's written to. For the time is what? Near. It is coming to pass quickly. It's said in other ways throughout the letter. It is very relevant to the churches that it was written to. And so, again, we need to highlight that. In Revelation 22 and verse 7, he says, "Behold, I am coming quickly. Blessed is he who keeps the words of the prophecy of this book." To keep the words or the intention or the meaning of this prophecy, you have to understand it. And who was in the best position to understand it? The 7 churches it was written to. And in verse 10 it says, "And he said to me, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is" what? Near. It's near. When is it relevant? In the first century, to the people that it was written to. In verse 18, it says, "For I testify to everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this book. If anyone adds to these things, God will add to him the plagues that are written in this book." You know, it would be helpful if a lot of people read this verse. They would be a lot more careful and responsible with how they handle it. They wouldn't just assign this to this or that to that in regards to what we find in the content. Not that any of us understand it fully or perfectly, but I think people would be way more responsible with it if they heeded this warning in verse 18. It goes on and says, "And if anyone takes away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God shall take away his part from the book of life." Man, it got even more real, didn't it? "From the holy city and from the things which are written in this book." So it's kind of important to not miss the point of the revelation, isn't it? And it's kind of a big deal to misrepresent it. by being irresponsible in how we handle it. And so that's something we're really going to try to do as we go through this. Be very, very careful and be very meticulous in how we handle it and interpret it. And we best do that from their perspective. Okay? The next category of genre is apocalyptic. The word appears in the first verse. It says the revelation, the apocalypsis of Jesus Christ. And a lot of times people, when they hear apocalypse, they think of end of days, right? You hear the word apocalypse, you think, oh, that's the end of days. But that word actually means unveiling. Verse 1, it says the unveiling or the revealing of Jesus Christ. Don't miss that point because it's a big, big, major point in the Revelation is to unveil Jesus Christ. Now, you can study other apocalypses such as Enoch and other writings that were known during this time. And writings that fall in this category usually are a result of a vision or a dream, a visionary experience or a dream, where there is a revealing of heavenly secrets through heavenly beings to an important human representative of God. Okay? Where Revelation is different in regard to other apocalyptic writings that date near to this time is it's not this, I can't even hardly say this word, pseudonymous. Some of y'all, somebody help me and say it. It's not attributed to some historical figure in the past, like the book of Enoch was not written by Enoch, but it was written in his name, pseudonymously, to credential it, to validate it. And John is different in that regard, which adds to the uniqueness of Revelation. But it's similar in that it is a visionary experience, heavenly secrets or a heavenly perspective of what's going on in the world is given to the human representative, and that is to be taken and shared with God's people. And what it does is it contrasts the transcendent what is perceived as reality and juxtapose what is reality from the world's perspective and how God would see and view reality. And it highlights the temporality of worldly reality. And it highlights the heavenly perspective that's given through these visions or dreams, and how they should take precedence in the life of God's people, and how they should take in this perspective instead of the perspective the world is forcing on them that is leading to compromise and the things that are displeasing to God that He's trying to correct through these apocalypses. You follow me? So it's this otherworldly experience that gives a different perspective on what is happening in the world. And oftentimes it portrays and juxtaposes God and those who align themselves against God, and it brings through imagery and symbolism the fate of both parties. Blessing, rewards, judgment, etc. on the other end of the spectrum. And so it's a very, very difficult genre to unpack. Let me say this. It is apocalyptic literature is very similar to parabolic literature. And if you understand parabolic literature and you see it in Jesus' teaching, oftentimes parabolic literature is somewhat veiled to the obstinate and the hardened, the unrepentant. And that's kind of the point. A lot of times this type of literature further hardens the unrepentant, and it brings insight and understanding and proper perspective to the faithful who may be going through the fire, who may be, as we see in the 7 churches, in the middle of the fire, and they're being tested. And this new perspective, this heavenly perspective that's given through this visionary experience, sets right what is reality. Okay, because they're seeing reality in light of circumstances. They see, for example, let me take a quote from Revelation. And the beast made war with the saints and prevailed. Do what? The beast made war with the saints and prevailed? How's that? How can that be? If God is sovereign, if the kingdom has come and thy will be done, how is the beast prevailing over the saints? That just doesn't make sense. Why are we suffering? We're doing the right thing, and it seems to be backfiring on us. We're losing our jobs. We're being excommunicated. Our family is disowning us. What's going on, God? And God goes, whoop, let me give you a perspective outside of your circumstances from a heavenly viewpoint. And let me show you the end of the story. And in light of the end of the story and the blessings and the hope in those blessings, stay the course. It will be worth it. It doesn't seem like it now, but you're filtering things through a worldly perspective. See the bigger picture. Make sense? And that's one of the features of this genre and how it works. Now, we'll talk more about that as we get into some of the visionary experience. But the next question is, what are the literary features of Revelation? This is related to genre and the sources that are used. But what are some of the unique literary features of Revelation? And these are just a few. We'll add to this and we'll unpack each of these. But some unique literary features that we see in Revelation, and the first one is intimately linked to the genre, and that is symbolism. If you are trying to read Revelation literally, and you're trying to find a one-to-one historical correspondence to each thing that is described with a symbol in Revelation, you are about to make a wreck of this important book. It is symbolism. It is apocalyptic genre, and it needs to be unpacked according to that. And symbolism is not something that we're going and looking for a one-to-one correspondence, just like the parables of Jesus. We need to see the big picture in the midst of the symbolism. And so there's a method to unpacking the symbolism. We'll discuss that as we go along. But we need to recognize it from the outset. Another component, and this is related to genre, is dualism. Parallel or contrasting by juxtaposition, by polar opposites. And that's what we see. We see this in John's gospel, and that's great evidence for same author of the Gospel of John and Revelation, is dualism. There is the bride and the whore. There is the unfaithful city Babylon, and there is the faithful city New Jerusalem. There is the Trinity and the Satanic Trinity. There is those who have their father's name in their forehead and those who have the mark of the beast in their forehead. There is dualism all throughout that dominates the Revelation. Another component is numbers, numerology. You have a series of sevens. You remember in part 1 of the introduction, I highlighted the usage of the number 7 in Revelation. very unique to Revelation because 7 represents something other than the literal number of 7. And we're going to talk about the numbers in Revelation, and we're going to talk about what they represent. Matter of fact, I may, don't hold me to this, but I may next week spend the whole time talking and highlighting numbers and the literary usage within Revelation in regards to the numbers, because it's very, very, very fascinating, the numerology in Revelation. And a lot of that I derived from some of the resources I recommended that were produced by Richard Bauckham. He talks about the numbers and their meanings and the patterns that we see. So if you're interested in that, I would highly recommend you getting at least The Climax of Prophecy by Richard Bauckham. It is well worth your time to read, but it's not something you should read when you're exhausted and you're trying to check a box. Like, you need to be on your game. And they use a lot of big words. You're going to need a dictionary. You might need a little bit of Greek to kind of make sense of some of it, but it's worth your read in regards to the numbers. I'll try to bring some of that out. If I don't spend all of next week doing that, I will try to bring that up when we get to those points within Revelation itself. Recapitulation. Redundancy and recapitulation. We see that in Revelation. You have the series of 7s, which are a recapitulation of the same build up to the same end, and the end being the second coming, the return of Christ, the final judgment. And so you have recapitulation. It's kind of like a build up, rewind, build up again, rewind, build up again, and it shows the same end at each of the, at the end of the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls. You have the same end. Christ returns. Justice is served once and for all. And so we see that recapitulation throughout Revelation. It's not written in chronological order at all. Divorce yourself from that approach, because it is not written in chronological order. Hebraic writing just doesn't write in chronological order, and I know that's troubling to us. I mean, I get it. I'm type A. I like things in order, and it's just not that way. It's circular, and that's how they wrote, and we need to step into their world and embrace that. So recapitulation. What I stated earlier, reapplication and recycling of Old Testament passages with creative liberty and authority. I wouldn't recommend anyone to do what John's doing with the Old Testament passages, but he, as an apostle, has the authority to do that. But he takes those Old Testament passages, their context, he draws analogically from them, and he applies those symbols to the story within Revelation, and he does that with great creative liberty in his writing. Brilliant. Pay attention to the context that he alludes to in Revelation, because it's from those contexts that they are linked to Revelation, and you can draw the analogical application. Okay? So we're going to try to really focus on that as we go throughout. But I love what he does here with the Old Testament. The book of Revelation is a literary masterpiece, just like the Gospel of John. When you study the literary piece that it is brilliantly constructed, very carefully and very thought out in the way that it is put together, and we need to appreciate that part of it. The next question, what is the purpose of Revelation? I could probably write a book on this. I'm going to hit some of the highlights of what the purpose is, and you will see that none of the purpose of Revelation is to pinpoint events in human history. If that's your focus and that's what you're looking for, you're missing it. What is the purpose and why was it written? I've stated some of these, but they're worth repeating. To provide a heavenly perspective to the Christians experiencing tribulation. John comes out of the gate and says, I, your brother and companion in tribulation, am writing to you. And again, this is what apocalyptic literature does. It gives you a heavenly perspective, and it comes through a visionary experience and an important figure. To encourage and warn the churches to be uncompromisingly loyal to Christ, because they were facing the pressures of society, the beast. And they were in a position to either conform or suffer. And so it was written with that in mind. It was also written, as we'll see in chapter 2 and 3, to correct issues, specific issues in the 7 churches. So there is some historical application in that regard, that he is pointedly dealing with issues in the 7 churches. To counter the demands, so it's polemical, to counter the demands of the Roman imperial cult and emperor worship. That's why the first scene in the visionary is showing us who sits on the throne. It's not Caesar. It's not Domitian. It's not Nero. It's not Trajan. It is the one who was and is to come, the one the beast is trying to imitate. And it's giving us a fresh perspective. Don't worry about Caesar. He's not really the one who sits on the throne. He may be temporarily, but let me show you who sits on the throne, and let me let you hear what they're saying unceasingly about him. And that's what we're going to see in chapters 4 and 5. To show, and that's what this next point is, to show who is truly worthy of worship. It's not the emperor, it's not the pagan deities in Asia Minor. Yeah, there are temporary benefits that one can gain by simulating and worshiping. But in big picture, it's not worth it. It highlights the sovereignty of God, which would be questioned by those who are in the midst of suffering, persecution. Where is God? If God exists, why is there suffering? But it highlights the sovereignty of God because it shows us the bigger picture from a heavenly perspective. Justice will be served. And sometimes when justice isn't being served, people question the sovereignty of God. Why this? Why does evil exist? Why do bad things happen? And so it shows a perspective in that regard. It shows that God is faithful despite persecution and tribulation in the present world. It shows that God's judgments on the world are harbingers of the day of the Lord. And I discussed this on a Sunday morning a while back, how that the day of the Lord is a motif. And anytime there was predicted or prophesied to be a day of the Lord, it was always a harbinger of the ultimate day of the Lord, which is what Revelation focuses on as its climax. Despite how things appear now, sin will be punished. Even though the beast looks like it's prevailing, sin will be punished and evil will be dealt with. Again, it looks like evil prevails in this present world, does it not? Let me ask you this. Is morality on the rise or immorality on the rise? I mean, it's obvious to see. And so, despite how it looks right now, when you get this heavenly perspective, in the end, sin will be punished and evil will be dealt with. It also serves to further harden the unrepentant. We'll see that specifically said in Revelation. To further harden the unrepentant. To show the promised blessings of the eternal kingdom far exceed the painful sufferings of the present world. To show that God has faithful children from all tribes and people. They are a remnant, but they're out there. Proclaiming and living the true gospel results in persecution, which is the normal state for committed believers. Accepting this changed my life. Because the American gospel paints the picture like if you come to Christ, your life is going to be so much better, you're going to be richer, healthier, and blah, blah, blah. Not true. Not true. Your life here on earth will get more difficult if you faithfully follow Jesus Christ. Assured. Guaranteed. Guaranteed. And if it isn't, it's because you're compromising. So you need to heed the warning of Revelation. If you proclaim and live the true gospel, it will result in persecution. And that is the normal state for committed believers. We should just accept it. The beast makes war with the saints and prevails, so it seems. That's why we see a heavenly perspective of the end of the story. When we accept that, we'll deal with it better. There will only be two options in the final judgment: eternal life or the second death, which is being cast into the lake of fire. It shows us that Christ is worth dying for. And we're going to see scenes that validate that Christ is worth dying for. It shows us that a heavenly perspective is true reality. In a world that's trying to define reality and truth through its emotions and feelings, an apocalypse gives us a heavenly perspective that shows us true reality. It shows us that compromise with the world results in judgment. And it shows us that God can accomplish His purposes with a small remnant and not through worldly power. I mean, I think of the first century apostles without airplanes took the gospel throughout the Roman Empire on foot. And now, we still have it. All these years later, God can accomplish His purposes with a small faithful remnant. He doesn't need worldly power. And lastly, keys to a responsible interpretation of Revelation. I've already said these indirectly, if not directly. But keys to a responsible interpretation of Revelation is to know the cultural setting. I've given you resources to better know that than what even I've explained. To know and familiarize yourself with the Old Testament writings alluded to. Any cross-reference Bible will enable you to at least go back to the allusions therein, and you can go and read those. I mean, it takes time and meditation. It does require a lot of time and effort, but I think it's worth it. You need to study associated historical writings. You need to hopefully gain access to historical writings that accompany the first century, such as some that were referenced here, the writings of Irenaeus, Justin Martyr. I didn't mention him earlier. He's another one who affirms the authorship of John, who lived in the 2nd century A.D., and actually lived and taught in Ephesus. So that's further support for Johannine authorship. But we need to study those writings. And if you would like those writings, I can share ways that you can access them, and they're well worth your read. They shed light on a lot of the historical context of that world, the first century, the way people thought and believed, the way they handled the passages in the teaching of Jesus. So they're very helpful. Another thing is we need to understand the Roman Empire, and in particular, its influence over Asia Minor, as I described earlier, with the temple warden cities, with the temples dedicated to the emperors, and with the trade guilds that were there, and the implications of all of that together. We need to understand that, because that's what John is addressing and being polemical against in Revelation. So we need to understand the imperial cult and its demand for emperor worship, especially within Asia Minor. Any questions? I don't think y'all have ever been this quiet. Did anyone get any of the resources recommended and read through them? They require a lot of time, disclaimer, and they are hard to read unless you're really in a good state of concentration. But if you can read those, they will complement what you hear in this series very well, and it will add the stick factor to when we go through this. It will help you retain for the long term if you will complement our study with some of those resources. And I've read these resources, some of them multiple times, and they are good resources, and they offer eclectic views. Like, for example, one of the commentaries that are recommended by G.K. Beale, he's an amillennialist. Like, he's an idealist. But I probably like his commentary more than any of them. It's lengthy and it's hard to read, but it's a very well-written commentary as far as just a commentary on Revelation, especially in regard to the symbolism and the New Testament use of the Old Testament that we see in John. And he majors in that. He majors in the book of Daniel and Revelation, the Old Testament in Revelation. And so I draw from that knowledge and that level of expertise in that regard. And I'm going to encourage you to read some of those. So, no questions? Would you stand?